thank you very much. I said at the start for coming out and for being brave enough to choose a panel with the word economics in it. There were other choices. I'm surprised to see you all here, frankly. Let me just start with a phrase that I think will be familiar to everyone in the room. People are sick and tired of establishment economics. Anybody ever heard somebody say that? People are sick and tired of establishment economics. I want to talk a little bit about establishment economics with you today. And what I hope to do is to tell you something that can empower organizations and groups that are promoting a progressive economic agenda, that there is a progressive economic framework out there that will complement a bold progressive economic policy agenda. And there is an army of economists out there ready, willing, and able to support you in your push, in your quest for a more just, a more fair, a more equitable economy, more equitable social justice, and so forth. Programs, policies that are big and bold, ambitious, well beyond what the conventional mainstream views as feasible, right? These pie-in-the-sky sorts of things may not be so pie in the sky after all if you ask the right economists to look at your proposals. But who are those economists? And what does it mean to say that we don't want to do establishment economics anymore? So I spent the last year working in Washington, D.C. as the chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. I was hired by Senator Sanders near the end of 2014 when he called and we had a conversation. And a couple of conversations, actually. And both conversations were designed, I guess, to see if he and I were a good fit for one another. And obviously we were, because I ended up going to Washington, D.C. and working for him. But it might surprise you how many headline, so-called progressive economists aren't there for you when you need them. When you need them to help you push out big, bold economic policy programs, and they'll be the first ones to line up and tell you can't do it. It's not feasible. The math doesn't work. It doesn't add up, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about why that's the case, why the economics profession is so fractured, how to think about the economics profession, different schools of thought, where to reach when you're trying to reach in for somebody friendly to your agenda, and my own experiences, I guess, a little bit in trying to push back against some of this establishment economics. Is that okay? So I teach at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I took a leave of absence. I was chairing the department there and went to Washington, D.C. and did this thing for Senator Sanders for a year, and then left the budget committee and ended up advising the campaign. And when I was there, I did things like help find economists who thought maybe raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour was a pretty good idea. So, there are a handful of places in this country where the economics department doesn't look like the economics department in just about every other major university in this country. And those departments have a history, a tradition of doing more progressive sort of economics. So I called up a friend in one of those departments. He's here. I won't name him in case he doesn't want me to. But he's here at this event. And I said, I need some help. We would like to demonstrate that there is broad support for a $15 an hour minimum wage from our profession. Can you help? Can you help get a letter drafted? We'll gather some signatures, and then we'll show people that the profession actually has a number of credentialed PhDs who will say $15 an hour isn't going to kill off jobs and destroy the economy. And he said, yeah, I can help with that. How long do you have? And I said, not long, right? I need it like yesterday. And he said, well, it may be if I have a few weeks, we could get 50 or so signatures. I said, no, we've graduated enough of our own PhD students and placed them in departments all over the country. I can get 50 by tomorrow. Let's go for a couple of hundred. And we said, no, it's impossible. We'll never do it. Well, by the end of 3 or 4 days, we had 210 signatures. And that became a powerful instrument because when Senator Sanders and the co-sponsors of that legislation went out and said, we are advocating, putting forward, introducing a bill today to get to $15 an hour for a federal minimum wage, people immediately said what? You can't do it. It's too big. It's too bold. It's too much. It won't work. And they immediately started talking that number down. And he had a letter. And he said, don't tell me we can't do it. Don't tell me we can't think big. I got at least 210 professional economists right here who have endorsed the proposal, who say this is okay, we can do this, right? And time again, we were able to muster on financial regulation, did exactly the same thing with this Wall Street legislation on health care reform. But there is pushback, and the title of this panel features the name of one prominent economist who was part of that pushback, right? Part of creating a narrative that said, no, you can't. No, you can't. No, you dare not. You dare not. Because the serious people, the very serious people have looked at the numbers and the math doesn't work. Okay? So there are these ideologies, there are schools of thought within the economics discipline, but broadly speaking, we call it neoclassical economics. There's neoclassical economics, and then there's the stuff that's not neoclassical economics. And that can be institutionalist, it can be Marxist, it can be post-Keynesian, it can be a lot of other things, but it's all outside that mainstream. Within the mainstream, there is a very comfortable brotherhood. Right? If our colleague Jamie Galbraith was here, also one of the advisors to Senator Sanders' campaign, along with the two of us, Jamie has written about this group. You know, they fight like hell, but at the end of the day, he says they're like Tweedledum and Tweedledee because they agree on all the big stuff. They're neoclassical economics. They have a fundamental faith in markets as a force that will self-correct things. Their big fight is over how long it will take to self-correct, how long it will take the system to fix itself. One side says it will happen very quickly, and you can leave a total hands-off approach, laissez-faire, and the other side says, it takes too long. There's a role for government in that intervening period to do small stuff, to try to boost along the process back toward an equilibrium. And then there's everybody outside of that mainstream who says, we can't just simply sit back and rely on market forces or small ball interventions designed to take the edge off the cruelty that is the market economy, that we need bigger, more structural changes and so forth. So I'm going to just stop by way of that introduction and introduce to you my colleague and friend, William K. Black.
Thank you, also known as Bill. We were asked to make 2 announcements. So Josh Fox's film, How to Let Go of the World and Love All the Things Climate Can't Change, will be shown in this room from 7 to 8 p.m. We'll have extensive time for Q&A, and you're asked to line up along that wall and then come up to this mic individually to ask your questions when you do that. So I have a weird background. My primary appointment's in economics. I have a joint appointment in law. I'm a white-collar criminologist. I'm a former financial regulator. I'm a serial whistleblower. Founder of this bank, Whistleblowers United, that wants to imprison the felons on Wall Street. And 20% of Bernie Sanders' economic advisory team. Together we're 40%. You can do the math. Okay, so my name is Jack Black when I'm in Iceland, apparently. Yes. and I will say that Iceland's the point. So Iceland has, on a really good day, and most days aren't really good days in Iceland, 320,000 population. But they were managed, they had 3 giant banks that brought down their economy. They've managed to convict the CEOs of every one of those institutions, plus many of the other leaders. And they did this with a total staff that would be one of our U.S. attorney's offices in the United States context. So the problem is not the ability to prosecute. In the savings and loan debacle, we successfully prosecuted and got felony convictions on over 1,000 insiders. And those were hyper-prioritized cases involving the people in what we call the C-suites, the CEOs, the CFOs, a former governor of Illinois. I know everyone does that, but we're in Chicago, so I mentioned that as well. It's a matter of will, but it's also a matter of ideology. And one of the terrible things economics does is tell people no, as Stephanie just emphasized. No, you can't. No, you can't prosecute because a business person would never commit a crime. No, you can't regulate because that would be wrong. No, you can't intervene on behalf of people who are hurt because that will just make them worse off, etc. Okay, so let me just start with a baseline of, Stephanie talked about the difference, and these people are really weird. They call themselves freshwater and saltwater economists, so it's strange, I know. But the ultra folks are based here in Chicago, or at least started here. They're the freshwater, and they're the ones who say, oh no, the market will fix everything, and anything you do will just make stuff worse. Right? Well, the other folks are not much different, hence the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and they say, well, maybe we'll change it a little. Let me just give you baseline numbers to start this out. The best estimate of economists is that in the United States, the lost GDP through the course of this Great Recession and recovery will be $24.3 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. Okay, these are numbers so big, unless you studied physics, they have no meaning. Economists have no meaning for economists. We lost 9.3 million American jobs. We had over 5 million American jobs that normally would have been created that were not. We have ballpark 10 million foreclosures, and 4-ish people times that gives you for the number of people in the household. Latinos households where there was at least a university degree lost 72% of their wealth. That's the median loss. Blacks, that comparable figure is 60%. Those losses are much greater than comparable Latino and Black households where there wasn't a university degree. In other words, you lost more wealth the better educated you were if you were Black or Latino. The opposite pattern was true for whites. Right? And it's in large part because of this refusal to talk about the fundamental problems, that there isn't a market. Right? Let me just take you through the 3 big fraud epidemics that caused this crisis. The first one was appraisal fraud, right? This is inflating the value of the house. Now, you and I can't inflate the value of our house successfully. The appraiser does it. We have no leverage over the appraiser, but the lenders do. They say, you want future business? Inflate the value. And the appraisers publicly, new media stuff, online petition, very savvy, went to all of the right government agencies, said, and it said this in the year 2000. Think how long ago that was. We are being extorted by the lenders to inflate the appraisal. And if we refuse, then we are blackballed and we are not given future business. So that's not a market. That's an extortion racket, right? And that, how successful will we have surveys? By 2006, 90% of appraisers reported that they were personally subjected to that kind of extortion in just the most recent year, right? So this is massive. Liar's loans. The industry's own anti-fraud experts report 90% of these are fraudulent. 9-0. No one ever encouraged banks to make liar's loans, and the lies in liar's loans, according to the attorney generals who investigated, were overwhelmingly put there by the lenders and the lenders' agents, the loan brokers. Well, how many liar's loans were there? Well, by 2006, 40% of all the home loans made that year were liar's loans. That means there were over 2 million fraudulent liar's loans pumped out just in the year 2006. Why? Because the commissions created the incentive to do this. That's not a market. That is how the system is rigged. When Senator Sanders and Senator Warren say the system is rigged, that's not colorful rhetoric. That is an accurate description of the financial system as written by technical economists, if they had the guts to actually write it. But Paul Krugman isn't about to ever say that, because he'd be drummed out of the academy. But we say it all the time because we know it's true. And the third epidemic, of course, is there's no such thing as a fraud exorcist. So once the loans start out fraudulent because of the appraisal fraud, because of the liar's loans, you can only sell them to the secondary market through a fraudulent representation and warranty. So fraud begets fraud. It's very biblical in all of this. And we have numbers on this too. You know, this is what economists are supposed to be good at. They're supposed to be good at incentives, and they're supposed to be good at numbers. And they are terrible at both of these things. Have you ever seen a Krugman column that has the numbers I've just given you? Right? Never. Do you expect to see it soon? No, you don't. You ever seen him quote a white-collar criminalist? No. I mean, why would you go to another discipline that has expertise? Anyway, the numbers, and these are from the industry itself, and these are the high clowns of the industry, right? Are that by the end of the mid of 2000, over half of all the representations and warranties looked at were false. And I can tell you with my bank whistleblower hat that one of our founding members was the top guy at Citigroup, really senior vice president, staff of 300 reporting to him, who found that 80% of the representations and warranties that Citigroup was making to Fannie and Freddie were knowingly false. Reported this, including to this guy named Bob Rubin, that you may have heard of. And as Bob Rubin testified to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, I was assured that the situation was resolved. It was by firing the guy that blew the whistle and continuing to defraud.
They don't call it the dismal science for nothing. Listen, I don't want to let the session expire. What we do want to do is allow some time for Q&A, because we really want to hear from you and want to engage with you. So we have definitely planned to build that in, but I don't want to let this session get by without making a point that both Bill and I make routinely in our own work, and that we make when we talk to groups and organizations and other staffers, and when I was on the Hill. This was a really important point for me to get out there, and so I'm going to get this off my chest. Okay, are you ready? When somebody asks you, how are you going to pay for it? Whether it's infrastructure investment, whether it's dealing with climate change, whether it's health care for all, whatever the big bold agenda item is. How are you going to pay for it? In my opinion, the most correct and powerful answer is to simply say Congress will authorize the spending. Because that's how it actually works. That's the truth. That's how it all works. If you're talking about Congress doing anything, how did it get done? How did it happen that we did infrastructure the last time we did infrastructure? A bunch of people went in and said yes to infrastructure. The vote itself, the authorization, triggers the spending. And the government is never, think about this, right? What do people say? Well, how are you going to pay for it? You're going to have to cut something else out of the budget. You're going to have to cannibalize someone else's program if you want to put more money into Medicare or Social Security or infrastructure or whatever it is, right? You're going to have to cannibalize somebody else's program, or you're going to have to raise taxes because everything has to be paid for, and you're going to have to find the money. Or you're going to end up what? Doing something just so fiscally irresponsible. And that fiscally irresponsible thing is called running a deficit. Running a deficit. You can't possibly run a deficit because what will happen if you run a deficit? Oh my God, the world will come to an end. We're in hock to the Chinese. There are bankers. They own us. They trump up all that fear, right? Fear of China. We're going to burden the next generation. So then they make us feel guilty and terrible and awful because we're hurting our grandbabies. And so they tell us that's going to happen. Then they make us afraid of bond vigilantes who are going to come and they're going to downgrade our debt. We won't be able to borrow anymore. We're going to end up in a third world country sort of situation. Greece will happen. If we don't get our so-called fiscal house in order, we all know we're going to end up like Greece, and the excuses pile up higher and higher and higher. And guess what? Hyperinflation. You want to end up like Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany? So they erect a wall. I'm telling you, this wall is the greatest barrier to entry to the progressive agenda I have ever seen in my entire life. If you can't penetrate that wall, and you don't realize that there is, as I said, an army of economists with real PhDs that came from real universities who will stand beside you and help you articulate a narrative that explains exactly why it is the case that the government is fundamentally different from a household, from Greece, which is a country that, by the way, gave up its currency and adopted this crazy thing called the euro, which is like adopting a foreign currency, which is at the root of the problems in the Greek debt situation, that governments have the ability, when we're like the United States, to authorize the spending. They are the old, but think about this. Where does the United States dollar come from? Does it come from China? Does it have a little stamp on the bottom that says made in China? Where does the US dollar come from? It comes from the federal government of the United States. It comes from the government, and it can't come from anywhere else. What happens to you if you try to create dollars? Maybe in your basement or something. Well, there's a word for it, right? We call it counterfeiting, and you go to jail. The United States government is sovereign in its own currency. It's the issuer of the currency. The rest of us, businesses, municipalities, Detroit, Puerto Rico, right? You and I, small business owners, we're all just simply users of the currency. We're users of dollars. And we're in a very different relationship vis-a-vis the dollar. We can only afford to spend what we can earn or what we are able to borrow. And lenders care very much about our capacity to repay loans. Okay, sitting not too far from me is the son of the late and great Hyman Minsky, one of the most important economists of the last century. And Minsky is famous for articulating financial instability and talking about why it is that businesses and households can get themselves in a situation where private debt becomes a huge problem. We see that everywhere today. Student loans, mortgage debt, right? Private debt can be an absolutely critically devastating problem, right, for people who take on debt. But for the federal government of the United States of America that spends, collects taxes, and borrows in its own sovereign currency, things work very differently. And most people have never been, it has never been explained exactly how governments go about financing spending in a country like ours, like in Canada, like Australia, like in the UK, why countries that operate after the gold standard are very different, right? We are basically running around operating our government, operating our economy as if we're still on a gold standard. What did Williams Jane Bryan say about the gold standard? What do you call it? Cross of gold, right? Never again on a cross of gold. Only we still are making economic policy as if we are constrained by gold standards, as if we have to find money, as if we have to dig up a shiny rock from under the ground somewhere in order to give us the ability to move resources around in the economy. This isn't what we did in World War II. This isn't what we did during the New Deal, right? What did they do? They authorized the spending. They mobilized the resources. They put people back to work. And by the way, another one of Vincent's most important contributions was, for decades, this man promoted the idea of a federally funded jobs program, a job guarantee program, right? And one of the things that Senator Sanders has done is to revive the Second Bill of Rights. This is what he's talking about. He talks about economic insecurity and why people are so afraid and why people are angry and why people are turning out in thousands and thousands for his rallies and so forth. There is such a high degree of economic insecurity in this country. 1 in 3 people is either living in poverty or is in near poverty. They're economically insecure. 1 in 3, we're talking about 105 million Americans, right? So he says he wants health care to be a universal right. He wants people to have a right to an education, making public colleges and universities tuition-free. And FDR said, as part of his Second Bill of Rights, that along with those two ought to come a right to employment. If we're going to tell people in a market economy you need to have money in order to survive, you must ensure that there is a way for people to earn a living. And so I want to put that out there. What happens too often is, take infrastructure for example, right? A large-scale infrastructure investment program is something that historically both sides could get behind. Republicans could get behind infrastructure, right? And it's not viewed as wasteful government spending. It's not viewed as an intrusion into what the private sector is supposed to rightly be doing and so forth. So you say, well, let's have a big infrastructure investment program. God knows we need it. The American Society of Civil Engineers says that we are in deficit to the tune of $3.6 trillion, meaning we should be spending $3.6 trillion or so to get our national infrastructure up to snuff in this country. Senator Sanders introduces a piece of legislation and says, let's take a big bite out of that problem. Let's go for $1 trillion over the next 5 years. And what happens? How are you going to pay for it? And he says, we're going to pay for it by closing tax loopholes. We'll get the money somewhere, so we'll raise taxes. And what do the Republicans say? No, you won't. We can't vote for it. We can't vote for it because it involves tax increase. And what I'm suggesting is that these are two separate issues. Not that there's no reason, no rationale, no justification for increasing taxes to affect distribution, concentrations of power, and other sorts of problems in the economy. Absolutely. But if you think that you need to go out and find money under the seat cushions in order to be able to afford the infrastructure investment program as the issuer of the currency, you've got things fundamentally backwards, okay? I keep seeing a hand. I don't know if you're telling me to stop talking or you want to ask a question.
I want to ask a question and also thank you for making
Okay.
this point about how, they're always saying how do you pay something, how are you going to pay for it? Because we've been campaigning for a living wage for mothers and other caregivers, and they say we can't possibly afford that, even though they're paying it in other countries. But when you mentioned about the poor, when 70% of the poor are women and children, and a lot of that is because the work that they're doing is either not paid or low paid, as in, the kind of caring work. It's very critical that we get that out. But we also, another argument is in addition to saying, well, Congress authorizes this, point out how much we're actually contributing and the economic value of that, which is what, $4.5 trillion a year in caregiving alone. So thank you for.
You're welcome. Yeah, absolutely. So articulating a policy the way you just did, right? Defending the policy on its merits and pointing out the broader benefits to society, to the economy, and so forth is exactly, I would say, the right way to go about doing it. I don't know how close we are to stop.
If I can, we'll go about 5 more minutes and then we'll do a whole bunch of Q&A, but please go to that side and come to the mic. Anybody that wants to be lined up. Actually, in particular, the point you made is an example of how a national entity is different than a single household, right? Income is not destroyed under a scheme under which mothers, for example, who stay home are paid, right? The income is still within the system. And this is one of the reasons why it's the worst possible metaphor to think from what is life like for me with my personal budget to what a nation state is that has a sovereign currency. So here's a thought experiment. It's the early 1940s. France has just been defeated. The Nazis are threatening to invade the United Kingdom. Churchill's running a deficit. Should Churchill surrender? We would all think that was crazy. But that is exactly the logic that you get. You can't spend money to help poor people. Well, why not? You have every capability of doing so. The question is it going to make your society better off? And the answer in almost all cases is yes. Remember I told you, the lost GDP in the United States over the course is $24.3 trillion. Compare that to the numbers you've heard. It'll give you some idea of perspective that even these very large spending programs are actually tiny compared to the cost of austerity. The cost in the EU, because of austerity, is massively greater than 24.3 trillion. Virtually every college graduate in huge swaths of Europe, Italy, Spain, of course Greece, but many other countries, as soon as they graduate, they leave the country. Because youth unemployment is at or about 50% in each of the 3 nations that I've talked about. You want to talk about investment for the future? You take your allegedly most productive to be folks with the university degrees and you say, we don't want you. Go to some other country. Well, that'll be good for growth down the road. And all of this is with the rhetoric that we're doing this for our children. We're sending our kids into mass unemployment to protect them. In any other sphere, any other academic field, you'd be laughed out of the academy. Here you get a Nobel Prize.
One of the greatest prize awarded by the establishment to one of their own.
And Paul Krugman just randomly happens to be a recipient.
Let me tell one story, and then I know there's a long line of people, but I just want to drive this point home about where's the money going to come from? Where's the money going to come from? That's the big hurdle before you can get anything on the progressive agenda for how you pay for it, where's the money going to come from? When the economy was hemorrhaging 800,000 jobs a month, right, at the height of the Great Recession, the deficit exploded. Absolutely exploded. Why? Because 800,000 people a month losing their jobs, losing their source of income, meant that tax revenues just fell off a cliff. People not working, not earning an income, not paying income taxes, right? Federal income taxes. Meanwhile, spending to support the unemployed automatically explodes. Why? Because you're providing unemployment compensation, and food stamps, and other forms of Medicaid, and other types of spending, right? So the deficit blows up. Ben Bernanke goes on 60 Minutes, and he sits down with Scott Pelley, and they're talking about all that government has done to intervene in the wake of the Great Recession, all of the money to bail out Wall Street, the deficit blowing up, and so forth. And he says, is that taxpayer money you're spending? Is that taxpayer money? Now listen to what Bernanke says. I'm going to quote him. It's not taxpayer money. We simply use the computer to mark up the balance sheets in the account. We simply use the computer to change the numbers in the balance sheet. So if we need to lend money to Goldman and AIG and whatever for balance, we have a computer at the New York Fed, and somebody types in some numbers, and all of a sudden, there's new money created as a consequence of spending. Now, shake your head because it sounds crazy, only that's how all government spending works. He's not saying we're trying this new thing out and we're going to use the computer. This is how modern money works. We are not on a gold standard anymore. This is how it all actually works. One more example because it's empowering, and then I either turn it to Bill or we go to Q&A. Okay, one more example. Years ago, Greenspan is chairman of the Federal Reserve. Alan Greenspan is testifying before Congress under oath as chairman of the Fed. And he's posed a question by Congressman Paul Ryan. And Congressman Ryan is trying to get Social Security partially privatized. And he wants Alan Greenspan, he wants to tee up a nice softball pitch that Greenspan can just knock out of the park. So he asks Greenspan to agree with him on the following. So Ryan says, wouldn't you agree with me that now is the time to begin to move toward a system of personal savings accounts? That is code for privatizing Social Security. Shouldn't we begin to move to a system of personal savings accounts? Because as we all know, the system is unsustainable, it's going broke, we're going to have to make major changes, so forth and so on. And Ryan ends the question, and Alan Greenspan leans into the microphone, and he delivers Paul Ryan's worst nightmare of an answer. And it was great, and you can YouTube it. And he says, well, I wouldn't say that Social Security is unsustainable as it's currently configured. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. That's a quote from Alan Greenspan. And that's the part that should be obvious, but it isn't obvious. But that's the part that should be obvious. We can always mail the checks. We got the printing press. We can always make good on every promise to every retiree today, tomorrow, and into the indefinite future. We can always do that. But then Greenspan made a really important point, and this is the point that people in the community and the activist organizations need to understand. Here's what Greenspan then goes on to say. The question is, how do you set up a system which ensures that the real assets are created, that those benefits are employed to purchase? It's a direct quote, and it's Greenspan, so I have to translate. So what he's saying is, we know that we have demographic changes taking place. The baby boomers are moving into retirement. Women are having fewer children. There are going to be fewer workers left behind, producing things that are going to be needed by everyone in the economy. So, Greenspan says, how do you set up a system that ensures the real assets are created, that those benefits are employed to purchase? What he's saying is, how can you make sure that we're going to be a productive enough economy in the future to make sure that when we send the checks out, as promised, in full, without cuts, that there's enough stuff for everybody to have some to consume without generating inflationary pressures, without causing us all to compete for a shrinking pool of actual output. And that's the right answer, and that's the debate that we should be having. We shouldn't be talking about whether we can afford this and that, where are we going to find the money. We know that it's not about financial affordability. The debate we should be having on the Social Security side is what Greenspan is saying. What can we do today? What can policymakers do today to help ensure that 10 years, 15 years, 25 years from now, the U.S. economy is productive enough to allow us to enjoy a rising standard of living, to allow us to have everybody have a better and better life going forward when we know we're going to have fewer workers in the workforce and more retired people to care for? What are the investments that we can make in our infrastructure, in education, in research and development, in technology, in all of these? What would you be doing today if you were trying to plan for an economy that you want and need to be more productive in the future? And that's where the debates should almost always be focused, on real resource use, on real constraints in the economy. If the real resources are available, the financial resources can always be deployed to achieve broader macroeconomic and political and social goals. It's not about how are you going to pay for it in financial terms. It's about how are you going to pay for it in real terms. Do you have the people? Do you have the raw materials? Do you have the spare capacity? If we want to do $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, we can have the money to pay for it. Do we have the skilled labor? Do we have the capacity, the excess machine tools and so forth that we need? Those are the constraints in an economy in a modern era like the United States government, not the financial constraints. So,
And I just say, remember that when we're talking Greenspan, we are talking literally an Ayn Rand devotee, an executor of her will. Please come forward. And the usual injunction, you can see how many people are in line. Try to keep it brief because we won't. Yeah, I know.
Speaking of looking to the future as far as economy goes, I come from experience in metal manufacturing, and I had the opportunity to actually be in this building here for the National Manufacturing Trade Show. And they have all these amazing automated technologies. How do we deal with the possibility that most manufacturing is going to be taken over by automated technologies in the future? And in line with that, have you looked into the economics of a guaranteed basic income?
Okay, let me partially repeat the question so people who may not have heard. His question is, he has worked in manufacturing and has a question about the prospects of robots taking over more and more of the work, and have I looked into the economics of the basic income guarantee? And the answer to the last question is yes. And not as closely, though, as many of my colleagues at my university and some graduates of our program. But here's what I can tell you. I think that I have sympathy for basic income with conditions, and there are many conditions, okay? It is not a panacea. And the idea that we've entered or we are entering an era in which nobody's going to have to work because the machines will do all the work and we'll just mail checks to everybody seems not plausible to me. The part that scares me about the basic income guarantee is this is a proposal that had support from people like Milton Friedman, Chicago School. Many of the libertarians absolutely love this idea because, and then some of my libertarian friends, people that I've known for a long time, love this idea. Why? Because you just send somebody a check and then it's all up to them how they want to live their lives. But guess what else you do? You take away all the other programs. So the thing is sold almost always as a replacement for virtually every other form of security, of welfare, of guarantees, of programs that are designed to help the unemployed and the impoverished and so forth. And so what if somebody came up to you and said, I'll mail you a check for $15,000 a year or $25,000 a year. Every year on the 1st of January, you're going to get the check in the mail. No more health care. There's no Medicaid, there's no Medicare, there's no Social Security, there's no unemployment compensation, there are no food stamps, there's no income tax rate. All that stuff goes away, right? All of it's gone. But you're going to get a check for $25,000 or so on the 1st of January, and you'll be good. Right? So you've given up programs that took decades, or in some cases longer, more like a century, to put in place and to protect and to build on over time. But you sacrificed all of them, they're all gone, on the promise that you're going to get your one check and everybody gets it. That's the other thing. It's universal, which means what? Poor people get their check. They pay for the cheapest Medicaid, or the cheapest health care that they can possibly find. They pay for education, they pay for their housing or whatever, and then they have nothing left, so they've consumed their entire check. The wealthy get their check and do what? Buy more Apple stock. So what do you suppose happens to wealth inequality as a consequence of the basic income guarantee? I think it gets way, yeah. I think it will.
Okay.
So that's my answer.
And
I have deep reservations.
And I'll just channel my wife's work. June Carbone is an expert on the family. Men in particular get vastly worse when they don't work. Because they actually contribute less household work when they are completely unemployed than when they're working 60-hour jobs. So I think for a very long time, humans are going to very much need jobs. And so we are oriented towards job guarantee programs as opposed to basic income programs. Thank you.
My name is Steve Capitan from DeKalb, Illinois, and when I was campaigning for Bernie, rarely but occasionally the socialist issue would come up. And what I would say to people is that, let's be honest, all of the wealthy, democratic, successful countries in the world are a mixture of capitalism and socialism. The only question is, what is the mix and how is it structured? What I would like to ask you is if you could comment about the economic benefits, since we're on that spectrum toward the capitalist end, as everyone knows. If you could comment on the economic benefits, broadly speaking, to lessening the wealth and income inequality, putting more hands more money in the hands, in the pockets of people who will spend it and generate economic activity.
All right, I'm going to leave that macro part of the question to Stephanie to answer, but I'll answer a different aspect of it, and that is what's really driving inequality is in large part compensation systems. And the compensation systems, yes, they cause inequality, but as I showed in the examples, these are the real drivers of fraud as well. And that fraud, think of the 24.3 trillion costs. Those are unbelievably large costs to a system. So you're correct, we've gotten enormously out of whack. We've swung very much toward Chicago school policies, and the results have been crippling. And they far exceed the resultant income and wealth inequality. They're actually destroying wealth. It's not simply they're redistributing the pie unfairly, they are now shrinking the pie. And they're shrinking it a lot.
I'll just say, on the inequality and the kind of mixed system, democratic socialism, the sort of Nordic countries or something like that. Look, Keynes, this is writing a long time ago, right? Keynes's general theory. In the last chapter of the general theory, the first opening sentence, he says the two greatest failures of the modern system, he's talking about capitalism, are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and unjust distribution of income. Those two things are related to one another. As you allow income to get more and more unequally distributed, and until a couple of years ago, it was the case that Senator Sanders had a talking point, and that was that 99% of all the new income was going to the top 1%. Okay, then a year passed and it became 58% in the recovery. Since the economy began to recover, 58% going to 1%. Well, that's still clearly vast inequality, right? What happens when you're shoveling wheelbarrows full, if that, metaphorically, of cash to the very, very top, to the top 1%? What is the marginal propensity to consume for people in the top 1%? How much consumption have they put off when the refrigerator goes broken or the car needs a repair? You know, these folks are not withholding any kind of consumption because they don't have the money to do it. Giving them an extra little bit of money isn't going to generate economic kind of aggregate demand. But when you redistribute in favor of the 99% that will spend virtually everything, or that bottom 90 that spend almost everything, you're going to get better economic performance. Less inequality means higher demand, means higher employment, means all kinds of macroeconomic benefits. And that's what the Nordic countries do better with their tax system, is they keep, now there are problems emerging, but they do keep a better handle on inequality through the tax system.
So I fear that I may know the answer to my own question. I think you might have touched on it briefly. Based on my own research, shy of completely altering fundamentally our economic structure and the system. My question is this: given that the Federal Reserve is a dual dichotomic entity in the sense that they print basically monopoly money that they can print at will, and the fact that they loan it out to the government at interest, who then charge us, I believe they charge us a certain, like basically we pay our taxes. So essentially my question is, how do we ever compensate the deficit if the free fake money is being loaned out to the government at interest that we can never pay back?
Okay. So we've paid it back once. Let's talk about this, because this is a good kind of way to segue into this. Have we ever paid off the national debt in this country? The answer is yes. When did we do it?
1835.
1835. Who was president?
Andrew Jackson.
How did it go?
We had the panic of 1837, which was versus the Great Depression.
Good. Very good. A student. A students usually sit in the front row. Midway back. That's exactly right. Got to know a little bit of history. We did pay off the national debt once, and it was absolutely catastrophic.
Are there other occasions in which we ran large surpluses?
There are other. I'm glad you asked. Some people, some Democrats, think of the Clinton surpluses as a badge of honor, a sign, a mark of fiscal responsibility. Why, if only we could go back to the good old days of the Clinton budget surpluses, when we were showing the world that we as a party knew how to behave responsibly. We ran those budget surpluses. Look, there's all kinds of material out there. Dean Baker, if you Google Dean Baker, Clinton, and Santa Claus, you'll get a terrific piece. Do that and read that piece. I've written about this as well. What does a surplus mean? It means that the government is going like this more than it's going like this. That's what a surplus means. They collect $100 billion and they only put $90 billion back into the economy. Now the government is running a surplus while the rest of the economy is in deficit. Good, because that's how balance sheets work. The rest of the economy is in deficit. Now watch me do the reverse. I'm government, I'm going to run a deficit this time. I'm going to put more in, $100 billion, than I'm going to tax out, $90 billion. I have a deficit of $10 billion. Where did the 10 go? It went into the rest of the economy, into the non-government part of the economy. My deficit spending produced a surplus somewhere else in the economy. This doesn't happen sometimes. It doesn't happen maybe. It happens always and everywhere and to the penny. Government surpluses are the deficits, are the accounting record of surpluses in some other part of the economy. And if your goal is to kill the government deficit, I tell you, my friends, you have set an agenda for yourself, which is killing surpluses in the rest of the economy. But nobody tells you that. Nobody tells you that. They've convinced us that in order to demonstrate fiscal responsibility, we must do what? Balance the budget.
Or better yet, have a
deficit.
surplus.
Have a surplus. So this is, again, where we come to the difference between the sort of economists who are the deficit hawks, who would tell you that we should have constitutional amendments to always and everywhere balance the budget, go back to the gold standard, so on and so forth, and the more forgiving economists, the deficit doves, who say, well, sometimes, even though it's unpleasant, a budget deficit is the right thing to do. You run those when the economy is weak, and then as the economy begins to recover, you move toward austerity. Because that's what they're telling you. This is consistent with what Krugman has written in his columns. Deficits in weak economies, surpluses as the economy improves, over the course of the business cycle, you balance your budget. Right? You balance the budget over the course of the cycle. This is not the proper goal for macro policy. You balance the economy. If you set the agenda to force the economy to balance the budget, you get situations like Greece. Greece finally achieved a primary budget surplus. They did it. Anybody want to trade places? Nobody would want to do that because they forced their economy to push the budget into balance instead of allowing the budget to balance the broader economy.
And we've run significant surpluses how many times in our history?
Well,
clarify? My question is how if the Federal Reserve.
We understand your question. Yeah, actually it was.
the Federal Reserve is not the problem. The Fed is not the problem.
I just want to suggest first off to everyone to check out the Bill Black report on the Real News Network. It's really great. The Depression and the financial crisis both arose out of real estate speculation as people seek to monopolize the value of the earth for themselves. People have no access to the bounty of the earth, so we're left competing with each other by selling our wages. In Scotland today, there's a very strong movement for land justice. I know that these movements exist in Australia as well. Is there space in the progressive movement for a system which returns the wealth of the earth to all of its inhabitants through the implementation of land value taxation?
Short answer is yes. It's a serious proposal. The economics always had substantial support. I won't go through the technical aspects but the whole concept of economic rent is really what you're getting at. So, yes.
That's it.
I come to this, and I'm from Michigan, and I'm through Michigan United,
We love you.
which
I listen to everything that you have to say, which sounds so wonderful. We need it in Michigan more than ever. Our governor has implemented an emergency manager, which comes in and guts everything, takes away our democracy rights and our ability to hold the government accountable right down to city council. And so I was just wondering if you could explain how everything that is good that I've heard you speak about, how do you get past an emergency manager rule? Because actually there's a lot of governors in a lot of states that are getting ready to copy Snyder's emergency manager, which takes away all the democracy rights that any United States American has.
Thank you. So I was born in Detroit and grew up in Dearborn, and this is something very close to our hearts. It isn't just that they've done this, but they've done this essentially to every city in Detroit, in Michigan of any size that has a black majority population as well. So it's racialized. So first, technical answer. States are not sovereign nations. They don't have their own currencies. States do have to balance their budgets by and large. But that's why the stimulus bill had a significant revenue sharing component. Now, it should have been much larger, but what killed it? It was a coalition of the Republicans and the Blue Dog Democrats, the new Democrats, who got together to destroy that. And that, again, this is Stephanie's point. These are self-imposed constraints coming in large part from the Democratic Party as to what establishes supposedly serious, reasonable people. And they have enormous consequences. We've been focusing on the economics, but people die. People end up with children. Yes, my stepfather died of meso from Ford Motor Company asbestos. It's very personal with me as well. And this is our point. We can do things about all of these. We have the capacity as a nation, but we have checked our will because of this ideological construct that has no basis in real economics. So the line is, and I mean no racial component with this, that, you know, the way you enslave people is but to get them to put on the chains themselves. And that's what an economics program is. Your kids or you yourself were carefully trained and taught that you couldn't really do much of anything. And that is a complete lie. And lies have consequences.
Professor Kelton, you had enlightened us that we are a nation sovereign in its own currency, correct? So can you equip us, the audience, as we go forth and spread the good word about regarding Congress, just it being a matter of authorizing the spending for programs such as large infrastructure. When they come back to us with issues of hyperinflation, and all the pushback from that, can you equip us with maybe a 1 or a 2 sentence plug that would so easily combat their fears of hyperinflation by just authorizing the spending of this? Thank you very much.
So one of the things that you probably all are aware of is that the Federal Reserve has been doing, or until rather recently, has been conducting monetary policy in a way that involved doing something called quantitative easing. Yes? Everybody's heard that term? Okay, so the Fed decided that it was going to try to help generate an economic recovery, more robust recovery, by engaging in this thing called quantitative easing, which basically just meant the Fed would go out and buy securities, U.S. government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, and give banks basically money in exchange. Where did the Fed get the money? It didn't get it from anywhere. As Bernanke told us, it got it from the keyboard. So they changed the numbers, they mark up the size of the account, they say now I have the treasuries and you have a checking account at the Fed. We call them bank reserves, doesn't matter. How much of that did they do? The answer is trillions and trillions of dollars. Officially, something like 3.6 trillion in quantitative easing. And people used to go on NPR and so forth and talk about all of the money the Fed was printing and pumping into the economy. The truth is it didn't make it into the economy. It was just a swap of assets. They bought treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and they gave banks cash in a checking account instead. So where is the inflation? The mainstream models, the conventional economic wisdom was that if the Fed did this, that banks would then have money, and they would then turn around and do what? Make lots of loans to people. And this would help boost economic activity and so forth. And that then was supposed to cause, as it generated more sales, it was going to push prices up, and we were going to get inflation. Some people thought hyperinflation because they were doing too much of it. And the answer is we didn't get any hyperinflation, nor did we move the needle much on regular run-of-the-mill style inflation. I will say that what I've never heard anyone, member of Congress, say that we have to be careful about deficits because of hyperinflation. That's not usually language that they use. What they will do is fall back on the Congressional Budget Office and the scoring agency, right, who takes a look at any proposed big spending and say, you can't do this because it's going to add too much to the deficit. And their concern is that it's going to push interest rates up, and that's going to crowd out other more productive kinds of spending, like business, private sector business spending, and so forth. So economists like us can counter that argument with lots of economic theory and, better yet, empirical facts to help undercut that argument in order to make way for support for these sort of programs. Hyperinflation tends not to be a concern. When do you get hyperinflation? There are a couple of economists who did a study for the Cato Institute of all places. They looked at every single example of hyperinflation that's ever taken place anywhere on Earth. They found 56 examples of hyperinflation. And what they found that was interesting is that there's not a single case anywhere on Earth at any time in human history of hyperinflation occurring because a government used its power to create currency to try to achieve full employment. That doesn't happen. What happens is you have governments that fall, you have coups, you have wars, you have famines, you have a shortfall of asset, of real supply, right, a famine or something, and then prices spike. But I can give you all sorts of material to combat the hyperinflation argument if you're interested.
So the short version is New Economic Perspectives is the blog where we write about this endlessly. And our colleague Randy Ray has a primer that's designed for general audiences as well that responds to all of these arguments.
Many of us, this is very hard to wrap your head around. Many of us learn economics about Adam Smith and the hand, and that's about it. And you try to follow other stuff, so this is a lot to absorb. But my question is, as the sister was talking about the Michigan, Puerto Rico is a lot worse. This Promesa bill is close to economic fascism as you could find. And there's a call in the island for people to say, well, just cancel the debt among progressive forces. Not, this bill would actually make it criminal for people to obstruct this oversight board. It's really a serious issue. So my question is, this call to cancel the debt, or what somebody else said, to nationalize the banks. I mean, I haven't seen those things happen in anything but a post-revolutionary society. Is that a reasonable call at this point, or how would we justify it, or how could that be operationalized? Both those issues, canceling debt in these places that are supposedly bankrupt, and also calling for nationalization of banks.
Let me start with the nationalization of banks and then hand off to you. Because I was a federal regulator, deputy director of the Federal Savings Loan Insurance Corporation, and we put 800 savings and loans into receivership, created new federal entities, and sold them. Nobody called it nationalization. Why? Because the president was Ronald Reagan. Suddenly, it's become nationalization. And you know what's really sick? The Obama administration uses this phrase. And uses this phrase as a basis for not acting. Again, these are the self-inflicted. Sometimes it's unintentional through ideology. Sometimes it's very intentional. And we have just demonstrated what everybody really knew but wanted to hide, that Puerto Rico is in fact a colony.
On the debt forgiveness, just really quickly, it's very hard. I would prefer to talk to you actually after. One of our other colleagues has a saying, debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. And what we're seeing clearly, I think, in the Puerto Rico bill is that they're absolutely committed to trying to do to Puerto Rico what was done to Greece. And it's exactly the same recipe for success.
Well, actually, it's Argentina too. They're really trying to force regime change.
My name is David Cox. I'm an economics professor at UMass Amherst, one of the other non-mainstream economics departments. Just like in the mainstream, there's a freshwater and a saltwater version of non-mainstream economics, although we're pretty close on most things. So let me just add to your point about there being no financial barrier to carrying out programs that will make people's lives better. The barrier is not financial, but if the government runs a deficit, it doesn't cause inflation, it doesn't crowd out private investment as long as there are unemployed workers and unused productive capacity. It does give rise to debt, and government's debt can rise. But I just want to point out that in 2009, when the big government stimulus program plus the effects of the recession led to a big increase in government debt, which is measured relative to the size of the economy. It went up to 90% by one measure. There are various measures. And people warned that the government debt was getting as big relative to the economy as it was right after World War II, when the war had been financed by borrowing. So what they were warning is that we'd be faced with what happened after World War II, which was 25 years of the fastest, most equally shared economic growth in American history. Pretty scary. question. And the question is, if we can all agree that there's no financial barrier to the government implementing programs that will benefit ordinary people as long as they're unemployed workers, if the left got strong enough to push through a real full employment bill, infrastructure spending, guaranteeing a job to everyone who's willing and able to work, and we got real full employment, then what would you suggest can be done about the fact that this is a capitalist economy, and that at real full employment, corporations have difficulty making the profits that they consider adequate because workers have a lot of bargaining power? This is a problem with capitalism. And how can that be dealt with?
Well, the last time that we had something that looked like full employment to me was in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? If you have one job vacancy for every job seeker, that's a rough measure of full employment, okay? Doesn't mean everybody who wants to work can find a job, but that's a rough measure of full employment. The question is, what were corporate profits like in that period? And I would suggest my memory, if I'm not mistaken, is that they were rather strong, right? And this was an environment in which businesses were offering perks and signing bonuses. I mean, we really had a very tight labor market, and businesses were competing more aggressively to get workers. But my recollection is not that this hurt the bottom line, but in fact that corporations and small and medium-sized firms did quite well in a full employment environment in which wages were going up and lots of people were employed and had money to spend on. So
Wasn't true in the late 60s.
Well, look, there's going to be a struggle over income shares, for sure. Well, we could talk again about some of Minsky's work. Your incomes policies, there are other sorts of things that one could do, but that's more for an inflationary problem. Let's talk, because we can talk wonky after this.
So my variant on this is my concern actually with the capitalist economy is the bubble, right? And I think that a lot of we don't think, we know, an enormous part of the Clinton economic miracle was simply two of the largest financial bubbles in the history of the world.
My question is student loan debt the next bubble? What is the impact on the economy of student loan debt? A few thoughts.
Okay, I actually leading a research project on this very question right now, and there is a student debt jubilee. In fact, that is the purpose of the study. The study is being done to look at the macroeconomic effects of a full student debt jubilee, which means forgiving $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. What would happen if we did it? That's the study. It should be out in the next couple of months. So the answer to your question is tremendous, and industries will tell you. It's not just the home buying industry, it's not just the auto industry, we know that young people and their parents are weighed down by student loan debt, that this means that they defer starting families. Household formation numbers reflect that. We know that they put off starting families, having children, fertility rates are affected. There are broader implications for the economy in the longer run as a consequence of these. But this is a drag on the economy for all sorts of reasons. Small business startups, people who have student debt and therefore can't take the risk, they can't get the loan to start the little company that they would like to begin to start. So it is a huge, the answer is it's quite significant, and our research is looking at exactly that.
But probably bubble is the wrong word and the wrong concept, and the ally problem is probably bigger, that they're getting crappy education, right? So even the Wall Street Journal on the front page ran that for-profit universities, you end up poorer by going to them than if you had never gone to them. And that, of course, is one of the supposed great reforms of the market, and it's actually catastrophic.
Great. So a lot of us are really bummed out being told it's okay, we'll just be with the Democrats for 4 years and build a movement, and we wanted something more radical sooner. So, what do you think would happen if we just went along with Hillary, economically speaking?
Okay, so take a look at Tom Frank's new book, Listen Liberal, for the policies of the New Democrats for 30 plus years. I think that you will get variants of that unless, and the only possible unless is the people in this room and similar who would have to fight tooth and nail basically to move the party, to transform it, and either succeed or be thrown out of the party, purged basically from the party, which I think is a real possibility. But I think that fight has to be waged because otherwise we know the default position. The default position for 30 plus years has been, well, you can see it in the West Wing, very neoliberal.
Right, thanks for the great presentation. I'm sure many people here have either seen the movie or read the book, The Big Short. I've been on the other side of that. I bought some property up in Minnesota, income property, and what I'm seeing, I'm not sure if it's safe to generalize from my personal experience, but I'd like your take on it. I'm seeing a situation where in order to transact the deal, as the seller, I have to come up with $4,000 of the $5,000 down payment. These are no doc, meaning you don't have to demonstrate your income level, mortgages. They're with high, thin credit files, meaning that if somebody gets a credit card and takes out a loan for $1,000 and pays it back, they'll have a good credit rating. And the appraisals, miraculously, have been coming in at exactly what the selling price is. Do you think we're headed for another mortgage bubble?
Yes, but not anytime real soon because you need a much hotter economy to generalize as opposed to a particular transaction, as you say. But as I said, by 2006, we were talking about 40% of the total of new mortgages were then essentially, no, not subprime, essentially liar's loans. So liar's loans are vastly more dangerous than subprime, and by 2006, half of all the loans called subprime were also liar's loans. They're not mutually exclusive categories. So yes, there will be future bubbles, and unless we change the ability of CEOs to create the perverse incentive structures, they will do so, and they will do so because it creates a sure thing. And you can look at the stuff we write that explains this in considerable depth.
One brief comment. 9 properties that I've sold in the last 5 over the last 2 years had all of these characteristics.
Thank you.
All right, hello. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to try to go quickly. A lot of us, or at least me and my father, I tweeted you a lot about my father, because for his Father's Day present was getting a tweet from Stephanie Kelton. And I was all on board with Sanders as a fighter for education, social justice, and equality. He was mostly with Sanders because you were there. And he's an economist, CPA, MBA, all of that stuff, and he was looking forward to having modern monetary theory up in the forefront. And I noticed that you guys don't specifically reference it by that theory. Maybe, we talk about all the characteristics of it, but not necessarily naming it by name. Similarly, Sanders also didn't name it by name, nor did he emphasize it in his campaign, maybe because the United States was barely ready for equal rights, now let alone this, which is, I think, our next step. what do you think our next steps are now that we don't necessarily have the platform of standards to talk about this, and that this necessarily hasn't been a priority in terms of addressing these specific issues, job guarantee, things like that? Where do you see us going? Is this going to be emphasized in different ways? Is this going to be strictly 210 economists? Are we just going to be tweeting about it? And where are we going here?
Wow. Well, first of all, your dad is adorable. He's a nice, hi, Dad. So I don't use it. I don't think the fact that people call it that meant that means that the insights aren't penetrating. It doesn't mean that we aren't getting through. I think, we talked about this earlier. This panel has the name Krugman, and we haven't spent all that much time. But I will say that if you read Krugman's blog and you've been reading it for a few years and you get into the comments section and you start reading, what I've seen over the last 3 to 5 years, I know he's felt, which is growing numbers of people who have come to the realization that a lot of the establishment economics is simply wrong, and on this pay-for stuff, and on the dangers of debt and deficit. The difference between where we are and where a person like Paul Krugman is, he says there's no problem with the debt and the deficit right now. It's a medium or longer term problem, but he yields to Pete Peterson and to the deficit hysterians who want austerity later. He says, no, we'll have austerity, not now, right? That's where he is. I'm a step beyond that in terms of, the way that I think about the dangers of debt and deficit for countries like the U.S., okay? And I think that more and more people are putting it together. They're understanding the reason the government in the United States is not like the government in Greece. They've drawn the right lessons from Japan, from watching the U.S., from watching where interest rates in the U.S. and the UK and other countries are, from all the bad stuff that was supposed to keep happening. Never happened. And people started to wonder, how do we explain the fact that all the bad stuff that was supposed to happen according to the mainstream models kept not happening? And they realized there's a problem with the mainstream models. And he has felt some of that, I think, in the comment section of his blog, and I see it all over the place. People are beginning to understand that we have the capacity to do so much more by virtue of the fact that we're not on a gold standard anymore. And it's just as simple as that. It really comes down to understanding the difference between a government that operates with its own sovereign currency and one that doesn't. And the space, the policy space available to countries like the US is a lot bigger than the space available to countries that don't have currency systems like ours. And I'm actually very optimistic by the momentum and the sheer number of people who are putting this message and pushing this message out. You're going to see it coming, I won't say who, but you're going to see it coming from a really interesting place here in the next month or two. It will surprise you.
So,
I'll give one hint. You're not going to get this out of me. I'll give you one hint. Patriotic. What?
okay, so an odd thing. This is one where the left and an important section of the right are actually completely on board. So professionals in finance will typically say all the things we have said. And it's a really odd and hopeful part of the world. And where Minsky now, in professionals in finance, you have to know, right? They do corrective education for folks who come out of standard econ programs and know nothing about that.
I forgot to mention, that is one of the groups that I speak most frequently to, and I know that Bill does as well. Large groups of financial experts, financial planners, organizations in the finance community are absolutely receptive to this message. They get it, they're interested in it, they want, as Bill said, they want to understand how things actually work, the monetary system, market, financial markets, and so forth. And so we've made real inroads with them, and they're powerful group with them. Anyway, thanks.
You didn't run to a new standard has been set.
Thank you very much for your being here. I'm a huge admirer of Professor Black. law and economics, the the marketization of law, the idea that rational behavior can result in the obvious economic and social benefit for us all. I'm specifically wondering about how our judiciary is affecting our ability to change our economic policies in this country. I think about I think it was a New York district judge who allowed a hedge fund to claim, to basically hold hostage a restructuring of Argentina's debt. So until the point that Argentina had to fork over billions of dollars. I wonder about with you're talking about student loan debt, jubilee, private property rights, how that's going to, who's going to exercise their private property rights to prevent such a thing from occurring? Is that, how would you talk about that?
Okay, so let me take a swing at this since we are in Chicago and the University of Chicago is here. If you're at the law school at the University of Chicago, you will be in the Daniel Fischel building. And Daniel Fischel was the expert for three of the most leading frauds in the savings and loan debacle. Famously said that Lincoln Savings was the best savings and loan in America. It was only the worst savings and loan in America. There were 3,000 members of the industry, so that's a 3,000 position error in a 3,000 position possibility. Then he wrote the book that has been used for a generation to teach American law students the supposed economics of corporate law with, you asked about the judiciary, Frank Easterbrook, former colleague of his at the law school, now Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And the book proclaimed, without ever telling the reader they tried their theories in the real world, and they had failed as disastrously as it is possible to fail. So yes, you got this propaganda, and people made a fortune. Fischel became a very rich person, such that he could endow a building. And yes, rational behavior, the leading writer of economic textbooks, introductory textbooks in the world, is Greg Mankiw. He famously responded to the article by a now Nobel laureate, George Akerlof and Paul Romer, about looting in the savings and loan debacle by saying that it would be irrational for the CEOs not to loot. Wow. So I call this Mankiw morality, and that's the level that this profession has fallen to, that we teach. Most of our people, more than any other professor, are taught by someone with moral views like that. And of course, it's terrible economics as well.
My name is Jimmy Blackford of the Alliance for Progressive Virginia. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share with me your general thoughts on Britain exiting the European Union.
I am not a Brexpert. Honestly, I'm not going to say anything, and here's why. I was just there. I gave a talk at the Bank of England a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to colleagues in the economics field and elsewhere, just friends. I said, where are you on this Brexit question? These are people that I respect intellectually. And they're on opposite sides. They're on opposite sides. There are the leave and there are the remains. And it's all too confusing for me to wrap my head around what the real risks are. I don't think anyone knows. I was asked by a reporter in an interview I did a couple of days ago. It's too tricky a question for me. I don't understand the issue well enough to. Do you know what he's talking about? Britain's going to vote here. Yeah. Bill, do you have an opinion on Brexit?
Well, it's clearly going to cause short-term disruption. There's no reason why ultimately the economics change a whole lot. And the reason is, you forget these supposed free trade agreements. In fact, tariffs are historically low. And one of the first things they would do if they exited was start negotiating a treaty with the EU to allow products in.
So sorry. Sorry.
The time has come along.
No. Well, we are screening the film in here again at 6 o'clock, which is very soon. So we were just like sneaking over to the tech podium. We don't mean to stop the conversation. Sorry.
It seems to me that there's no better example of your sort of bottom line theme that money comes from congressional authorization than the black budget of national security state, which is non-public and is estimated generally at $1 trillion a year. And therefore, the CIA, 16 other security agencies, NSA, etc. So, do you see a strategic use in politicizing that the U.S. government spends $1 trillion that it doesn't talk to the public about simply because it can? It just authorizes it. Then it could easily, just as easily, choose to spend $1 trillion on our infrastructure, our student debt, etc.
Yeah, as I said, neither Churchill nor FDR surrendered to Hitler because we were running a deficit. Whether it's black budget, brown budget, gray budget, white budget, you can spend it. You can spend it. And by the way, every leader understands that when a push comes to shove and does what needs to be done in their view.
When was the last time we fought a pre-funded war?
Two things. A friend of mine was talking to a CEO friend of hers just recently, and he was explaining to her that the rules under CEO compensation had dramatically affected, under Dodd-Frank, how CEOs were now conducting business. They were becoming even more short-term focused because now their stock options were not tax deductible. That's number one question. Number two, there seems to be going back to another conversation about printing money versus the gold standard. There's very much a push for people to go back to the gold standard. They believe that this is more security, that this is why we don't have value in our own currency. And I'm just wondering where you think that philosophy is coming from.
Thank you. As to the first one, bullshit. As to the second?
Where is it coming from? I'm not sure where it's coming from. Of course, people like Rand and Ron Paul and the Austrians always want to push a return to the gold standard because that was such a fantastic era in which there was great stability and prosperity. We used to have depressions, not recessions, but depressions, full-blown economic depressions as a matter of routine on the gold standard. Post-gold standard era, of course, we have a very different historical experience.
We had 25-year periods in which the overwhelming majority of those years we were in depression.
I can tell you where it's coming from. Where it's coming from is those who want to complete the shackling of government. They want to shrink the size of government, and they understand. This is why Rand and Ron Paul are always on about fiat money. They actually do understand that the monetary system that we have today gives government great leeway in the way that Alan Greenspan said. There's nothing to prevent the government, right? That quote I gave you. The Pauls understand that, And that's, I think, why they would like to see us return to a system that doesn't allow government to have that sort of power, right? That if you were to go back to a gold standard, you lose the capacity to do really big things as a government. They would like that very much, consistent with their libertarian principles.
So my question is, Bernie has proposed a financial transaction tax, and since it has not been, I know it has been proposed in the European Union, but it has never been done. So give us your thoughts on what do you think, what Bernie is doing to that? Is it reliable?
I did see him leave just a little while ago. I don't think Bob Holland is here, if I'm not mistaken. He waved as he stepped out. Bob is a UMass Amherst economics professor who worked closely with the campaign on some of the estimates about the revenue side of the financial transaction tax. The truth is nobody knows. Nobody knows what would happen, how much revenue or financial transactions tax would bring in. There are, of course, lots of people who say it would kill off all kinds of the industry. It is true that in Europe they're looking at this, and I think that out of the members of the EU, a majority have already green-lighted a version of what we call a Tobin tax or a financial transactions tax. It seems to me that it would, in a sense, work a lot better if it were more broadly adopted globally, because of course the argument is always that if you adopt it at the micro level, pick a country or two, then you're going to see business moving out of other countries. But Bill might.
No, I would just say that's part of the rationale for Brexit. The City of London is immensely powerful and is a trade of the financial transaction tax. And as Stephanie said, a majority of European states on record have been in record in favor of the tax.
Hello. It seems to me that one of the biggest trends that's going on right now is, I would say, a global effort by capital to restructure labor markets, to drive down wages. France, we know what's going on there. It's also been a trend after 2008, 2010 with right-to-work type efforts in different states. And arguably the TPP and other big arrangements are efforts to kind of set those the terms to favor that effort to restructure global labor markets in favor of capital. So I guess my question is, can you comment on that, and in terms of your perspective on what the strategy appears to be right now globally by capital to do that, and what are the most important tools that our movement can seek out to combat that as we go forward, to combat those attempts to drive down wages and restructure labor markets?
Yeah, so as Stephanie said, when the EU nations that are part of the Eurozone adopted the euro, they gave up their sovereign currency. And they made themselves susceptible to this. And so whenever you hear the phrase structural reform, that's code for bashing labor and reducing wages. And they roll it, so Spain must reduce its wages to compete with Portugal, which must reduce its wages to compete with Greece, which must, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yes, they designed this as a race to the bottom. They like this dynamic. Yes, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its Atlantic version would exacerbate this, but there are even more aimed at destroying regulation, which is all kinds of regulation, but particularly environmental regulations. So it's a multifaceted campaign, and it is inherently a global dynamic that they have set in motion, and they make the equivalent of executing somebody at high noon, and that's Greece, to show, how dare you in Spain, Podemos and such adopt progressive parties.
My dad is a reader of Krugman,
Have them read more broadly.
Oh, okay.
I'm a reader of Krugman.
Yeah.
And I can't think of anyone who is in many ways better at what he does than Paul Krugman is. And on a wide range of issues, I have appreciated his contributions immensely for a lot of years. Right? I think there are just some areas where we have disagreements. And what's interesting is that while our economic frameworks are different, we often arrive at the same place. You're relying on very different economic models. But sometimes adopting different models does in fact take you to different places. And when that happens, then there are important disagreements. So you can tell them about our blog, New Economic Perspectives.
Oh, I will.
Bill and I blog, and at least have him read more broadly. But
Or you could have him read the Krugman columns in Fortune, where he praises Enron as his exemplar for what the world should be like.
Oh, no, and I know that's bullshit.
Yeah, Enron, there's not much debate about. Pulling the plug. Okay, so really quick, we're being told we got literally 2 minutes, or 1 minute.
I'm really just a civilian with very little knowledge about this, but I'm curious. I have a sense that the recovery is not as solid as many people would like us to think. And could there be economic news in the next period that would affect the election? Because that kind of thing seems possible to manipulate, and I don't think the ethics of the folks that could do it are above that.
I don't think you have to manipulate it. I think it could happen quite organically.
China, the EU, Brexit, these are all significant risk factors. Nobody knows